All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon for a presentation from Sustainable Cleveland on Cleveland's Clean and Equitable Future, our 100% renewable energy plan. I'm going to turn it over to Jason Wood, our Chief of Sustainability, in just a moment. Before I do, just a couple quick housekeeping items, and I have just a few updates for you all in regards to our Circular Cleveland initiative. As attendees, you will all be muted, but we encourage you to please post any questions that you have during the presentation in the chat box, and we will try to get to those as we have time at the end of the presentation. The event is being recorded, and we'll be able to view that afterwards as well. So I wanted to, before we dive into Jason's presentation, just give a couple quick updates on Circular Cleveland. It's our initiative to build a circular economy here in the Cleveland region. Advancing health, equity, and climate in the Great Lakes is the overall title of our project. Just as a reminder, if you did join us back in January for this presentation, we received funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, partnered with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, the City of Cleveland, and Neighborhood Connections are the three main partners on this project. A few things in terms of updates, because I'm sure you've been wondering what we've been doing for the last few months. First, we're working on our roadmap. Very soon, we're going to be hiring a consultant. We've come very close, who's going to work with us over the next 8 months or so to develop this roadmap, which is really going to be kind of our guiding light on how we build this circular economy in as equitable way as possible. Additionally, we have some Circular Cleveland community grants available through Neighborhood Connections. We had some workshops yesterday, actually, and on last Saturday, some really cool projects that are starting to come up. We encourage you to take a look at some of the grants that are available. The deadline is coming up rather quickly, this coming next Friday, May 7th. So if you're interested, please check those out. Additionally, we are going to be looking for some Circular Cleveland ambassadors. There will be more information, including applications, to come in early May. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And of course, if you're on our Sustainable Cleveland mailing list, you will get all the information for those ambassador positions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Kathy Len or Divya Sridhar at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress or with our office. They can answer any of the questions that you have regarding Circular Cleveland, the Circular Cleveland grants, or the Circular Cleveland ambassadors once that is released. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, Jason, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Let me get mine up here, and I will take over from there, right? Okay. So we're really excited to be able to talk with you, everybody, today about this. If you've been at some of our meetings over the past year, whether it's the quarterly meetings when we were doing those, we talked a little bit about it at the summit, a few of these monthly meetings. We've really kind of told you that we were working on this project to transition to 100% renewable electricity demand by 2050, but it's done. The report's finished. So we're glad we're able to share it with you today and hopefully get some questions and some feedback on it as we go through it. So I guess I'll start with a little bit of context. And if you've been to a lot of these events, you may have seen some of this before, but our climate action plan is really centered on what I think is a fairly aggressive goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% over a 2010 baseline by 2050. Now, there's obviously a lot more in the climate action plan, but it is hard. It really is focused on emissions. We've made progress since we launched our cap in 2013. We've seen about a 9% decrease in emissions over that 2010 baseline. So we've made progress, but there's still a lot of work that we need to do. As we look at kind of what that means, we've got to talk about, when we look at emissions, we have to talk about energy use specifically, because it makes up such a large kind of component of our overall emissions profile. When we think about our cap, we have two kind of sub goals that are embedded in there that really kind of speak to the focus on energy use that we need to have. And one of those is to have 25% of our electricity used in Cleveland supplied by renewable sources by 2030. And the other is to reach 100% of electricity demand from clean renewable sources by 2050. On the first of those, I think we can say we've made some progress, right? We've put a lot of focus to date on the supply side of the equation. So this is really focused on the generation source of the electricity that's being used by Cleveland residents and businesses. This chart kind of shows the relative clean energy supply in Cleveland that comes from both CPP and CEI. And then if you look at the dark gray line, you'll see that also includes the renewable energy credit purchases that we make through our community choice aggregation program. You can see by looking at that we're about 13% currently. So about halfway to that goal, we're making good progress. And that's kind of what we thought we should see based on the attention that we've given to this part of the equation so far. But we wanted to make sure with this project on the renewable electricity demand that we were giving as much attention to the second of those two goals, right? So we went out and secured funding for Partners for Places, the Cleveland Foundation, the Gunn Foundation, and put together a pretty robust collaborative team. So we had a core team of folks who were working on this on a regular basis with us. You can see their organizations kind of spelled out on the right. Additionally, some subject matter experts who we really found to be valuable partners in helping us support our existing efforts and then also expand on those as we look to move towards 100% renewable electricity demand. Through this process with that grant funding, we contracted with an organization called GreenLink Analytics. They are a national leader on carbon footprint accounting, environmental and social impact assessments. They do a lot of utility resource planning. They are really well regarded in this space. And we kind of had them come in and help us develop the roadmap to look at our transition. So as we looked at the transition, we obviously wanted to focus on the environmental and economic benefits that we can see from transitioning to clean energy. But we also wanted to make sure that we're using this as an opportunity to address equity more broadly, but also specific to the energy space. Whether we're looking at jobs and job access or energy burden or any of the other measures we can look at from an energy equity standpoint, I think it's fair to say that we have quite a bit of work that we need to do. If we look specifically at energy burden, for example, which is what the map is kind of showing the relative distribution of energy burden across the community, we can see kind of the extent of some of these challenges. Nationally, we see that electricity and gas expenditures, household expenses for electricity and gas, account for about 3.6% of all household expenses. In Cleveland, it is much higher, right? It's about 6.5% on average. And then we see it becomes even more stark when we look at it in kind of these real terms of households. We see 100,000 households that live in high energy burden, right? So where their energy burden is greater than that 6% number. And 40,000 live in what we would consider to be severe burden. So their energy expenses account for more than 10% of their household expenses. So when we think about it with that kind of focus and the general focus that our climate action plan has, it was critically important that we put equity kind of centered into this process. And you'll see kind of how that plays out as we get to some of the details and the results from what the report kind of highlighted for us. So now that you've got a little bit of that background and that context, we can kind of dive into what's in the report itself. This is kind of broken up into several sections. This is kind of the table of contents for the whole report. We obviously wanted to start by taking a look at the local landscape and also the regulatory environment, because those two factors shape so much of what we can and cannot do from a clean energy standpoint through local action. And then really work to build. So we had some stakeholder engagement that we engaged in. This was candidly a little bit slowed down by COVID-19 as we kind of worked through what that process should look like. And then we get to the heart of the report, which starts with the ACEs model, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is. But it's the backbone of the plan that we use to kind of identify what pathways are available to us, and then how that links up with some of the policy and programmatic toolkit items that we can see in the report, and then also some of those next steps and commitments that we need to make as a city and as a community. I will go through these in a whole lot more detail here in a second, but I did want to start kind of right up front highlighting, I think, those key takeaways. And there really broadly are three of them. And first, I think we learned in this process that our ability to achieve our goal based on local action alone is constrained pretty strongly by state policy. I think if you want to think about it this way, for us to get to where we want to be and where we want to go without more support or a different approach at the state level is going to be very difficult. And you'll kind of see how that plays out in the data and what that means from a quantitative standpoint here in a second. Now, having said that, even within that constraint, it's important that we take action because it's the right thing to do, but also because taking action can have a significant and positive impact on the key priorities that we build into our planning process. And this includes promoting improved energy equity, leveraging it as an opportunity to bring in new jobs and create wealth for all of our residents, but then also improving the human and neighborhood health in our community. And then lastly, we do see that we have made some progress, right? So there are a lot of things that are happening and there's still more available to do. And we'll kind of talk to some of the specifics of those here in a second. So I'll jump now into the model itself. We do need to spend a couple of minutes kind of talking about this forecasting model that's used in the analysis. It gets a little bit heavy here on the math and the statistics, and I know not everybody loves that, so bear with me and we'll get to the conclusions here in a sec. But I do want to make sure that we spend a minute kind of talking about the advanced clean energy scenario tool that Green Lake uses to do their modeling. It allows us to model multiple pathways that we can take to achieve 100% clean energy. It uses machine learning. It really is kind of a heavily based machine learning model that looks at the entirety of electricity systems from the generation and the transmission through the distribution to construct kind of an hourly demand and supply profile that is specific to Cleveland, right? Because every community has these local contexts that you need to be kind of cognizant of. So for example, the Cleveland specific context allows us to model and look at 60 different building profiles that are found throughout community that account for differences in age, supply, building type, occupancy patterns, kind of how we use our built environment and our building stock. It then kind of shifts and looks at the generation assets that serve Cleveland. So what are the operational characteristics of those supply assets? So looking at fuel type, fuel price, generation costs, overall emissions, waste impacts. So really understanding what the power plants that can generate electricity and send to Cleveland are capable of and how they function. And then based on this, we're able to kind of determine the different pricing of energy resources and how much of that power resource can be provided into the Cleveland grid over time. And really looking at that from a longer term market forces and trends perspective, right? So as we go into this, you'll see that even in kind of that normal, don't do anything different case, we're going to see solar growth because the cost of solar is already kind of market competitive and it's declining over time, and we expect that to continue. So this forward-looking hourly demand and supply profile model is really kind of forecasting what that looks like moving forward. So once we kind of have those things, we're able to construct and kind of throttle up and down various inputs, whether we're looking at energy efficiency, solar power, wind power, a little bit of energy storage, and then even some changes in our transportation system. And then based on those throttled up and down inputs, how much we're willing to invest and how much we're really able to take in as a community on the input side, we're able to create some pretty detailed output analysis that look at benefits and costs, various environmental factors, the economic impact of action, the positive impact on human health that this can have. And I think probably most importantly from where we started this process, what the transition to 100% clean energy would look like in terms of energy equity more broadly. So we can use this tool to model an infinite number of possibilities, and we do have the tool. We can continue to kind of run different pathways and scenarios with it. I would pull it up and show it to you, but I'm working on my Microsoft Surface and it would crash if I tried to do so. It's a very big, robust program. But our report really looked at three pathways in particular. So we modeled the business as usual case, which is the approach where we take no additional action beyond kind of what we're already doing. So we kind of stop based on the programs that we have in place now, the investments that we've made, and then we just kind of let the market play out over time. The second is looking at what we call the most cost-effective pathway, where we're looking to maximize the overall return on investment. So in other words, we want the benefit cost ratio, which you'll see here in a second, to be as high as possible. And then we have the maximum pathway where we do everything that is technically, legally, financially, regulatorily feasible. We do everything humanly possible to kind of advance this. The chart on the right shows what the end result of the fuel mix is under each of these pathways, right? So you can see under the business as usual case, we see a strong growth in solar, right? So what we want to see here is more light blue, which is energy efficiency gains, orange, which is solar, and light gray, which is other renewables. And we want to see the yellow, dark gray, and green bars get a little smaller. Those are coal, natural gas, and nuclear. So you can see over our current condition, significant growth in solar under the business as usual condition. And that's kind of what we would expect to see from a market forces standpoint. But as we start to make investments on the most cost-effective pathway and on the maximum case pathway, we start to see some gains in energy efficiency and a little bit of growth in some of those other renewables that help push us up a little bit higher on our fuel mix to where we want to be. So here is the condensed kind of output table. You can see the three different scenarios and really kind of looking at kind of the particular impacts. And this is where we start to see some of those impacts of state policy, but also some of the positive benefits that we can generate by making these investments. So the ACES model is set to force us to achieve 100% clean energy. And it does that by using renewable energy credits as the backstop, right? So we're going to do what we can do under each of the pathways through local action. And then anything that can't be accomplished through that local action, we're going to purchase renewable energy credits in 2050 to make up the difference, right? So if you think back to the slide above, we're basically going to, local action is going to drive the orange, the blue, and the light gray. And then we're really going to use RECs to offset the yellow, the dark gray, and the green. While RECs are a strategy that is available and a lot of folks use them, and we do use them in the city of Cleveland now, it is, from our perspective, not the optimal approach, right? You end up outsourcing most of the environmental benefits of taking action, and you end up outsourcing all of the economic and the equity benefits associated with the actions you can take. So we want to minimize the amount of RECs that we purchase at the end of this process. And when we started the project, we knew we knew that we were going to have to buy a lot of RECs under the business as usual model. I think we were all comfortable with that. Where we were a little bit upended in our expectations and our assumptions was we really thought as a team that as we moved through the different pathways in the projects and increased the amount of investment we were putting in here, we would be able to dramatically move away from RECs as a tool and potentially even get out of the renewable energy credit business. And as you can see here, that is not the case. Under the max pathway, so under the business as usual case, we have to buy 5 million renewable energy credits. That's how we're offsetting that gap. If we do everything possible to us, everything that's technically, legally, regulatorily feasible for our community, at the end of this process in 2050, we still have to purchase 3.4 million RECs, almost 3.5 million renewable energy credits. That's about a 30% change for us. And this was honestly a bit surprising. And we did push back on the consultants about this and really wanted to understand why. And as we kind of worked through what was happening and kind of leading to this large requirement that we rely on renewable energy credits so heavily at the end of this process, they came back with a pretty clear statement on this. And this is all outlined in the report in a whole lot more detail. So again, I would encourage you to take a look through. What they saw is that our state level policy has not been supportive over the past few years of clean energy or energy efficiency. I don't think there's anything earth shattering in that to this audience. I think this is probably not anything that you have not heard before or haven't intuitively known or encountered in your own work. I think we all kind of thought this and felt this, but to see how clearly it limits our ability to take local action and make local change was a bit eye-opening for us. Now, I do want to say here, and it's critically important, that even within these constraints, though, we need to continue to take local action, and it is incredibly important to do so. One, because it's the right thing to do, and we need to make those investments and continue to make our commitments known to this. But it's also, there are still positive benefits that we can achieve from this. I think what we see from here from the limitations of the state policy is that the magnitude of those could be large if we had a little bit more support. So what are the positive changes we can look at? I'd start with the energy burden. We see under all three pathways that our energy burden measured by kind of that percentage of household expenditures dedicated to gas and electric declines under all three pathways. Remember, it's about 6.5% today. Even under the business as usual pathway, it's going to decline to 4.2%. And as we work our way out to the maximum case pathway, we end up seeing a burden percentage that is below the current national average, right? Now that's going to come down across the nation as well, but we are going to see some pretty significant improvements in energy burden as we take additional action. Percentages are sometimes an abstract way to think about things, but there are real monthly savings that we can point to. The model shows that as we take additional actions, we'll see monthly bill savings on gas and electric bills, not just for folks who are able to participate in the programs that we use to support this effort. Even if you aren't able or don't access one of the, or choose not to access or participate in one of those programs, you're still going to see monthly bill savings as well. There are also substantial job creation and income benefits of taking action. For example, if we look at that maximum case pathway, we see a net increase of over 5,000 full-time job equivalent across the research period here. We know a lot of these are those good, clean energy jobs and energy efficiency jobs that we talk about. They have the higher wages than what we normally see in the city, but also across the region as a whole. We also see some pretty strong kind of indirect and induced benefits in job creation through this. With that much income increase in the local economy, we see a lot of non-energy efficiency and non-clean energy job growth just from the multiplier effect of having additional investment in the community. So when we talk about good green jobs in our CAP, this is what we're talking about. These are the types of projects and investments where we can make to see some significant growth and improvement around this. And then lastly, we do see some fairly substantial accrued health benefits. This is primarily through deferred negative health outcomes. So we see less negative health incidents among people, and that results in improved public health savings over time. So how do we take all of that and translate it into action? The full report includes what I would consider a fairly robust clean energy policy toolkit. It includes about 70 different policies or programs that we can pursue locally to support our transition to 100% clean energy. I'm not going to go through all 70 today. Again, they're in the report. Take a look through. There's some stuff that we've seen, some stuff that's new to us. But we step back from that list and put each of them through an analysis that really assessed the feasibility. So can it be done in the state of Ohio? Can it be done here locally? What are the funding streams to support? So really look at that technical, legal feasibility of everything. We assessed the overall carbon impact. So how impactful would it be if we could get this policy or program in place? And then we also looked at it through an equity lens, right? Because some of these policies, as we step back, are going to have short-term negative equity effects, right? So they may make things even more inequitable. So we really wanted to create some scaling as we made decisions about how to prioritize action moving forward. We took a look at what has already been done, and this is important because as a community, we have done a lot already that we should be proud of. Right, so we've grouped the different policies and programs by the ACEs inputs, so energy efficiency, clean energy, which encompasses solar and wind, energy storage and transportation, but we also looked at them by who can move them forward. So of the 70, there are some that are within the capital C city of Cleveland's control, some require more utility support, some are going to need a broader community engagement, whether that's business community, philanthropic community, resident-led efforts. And some are shared among multiple kind of owners. Because we commissioned the report, we really wanted to focus this on the section of recommendations on the city action, so the things that the city has direct control over. That doesn't mean that others haven't done good work already or aren't needed to take action in the future, because solving this problem is going to involve and require everybody in our community to participate in a meaningful way. I think a good example of this would be something like the green bank, right? So one of the recommendations in the policy toolkit is to stand up a local green bank. And we have one in Cleveland. It's launching, it's getting up and running, but it's not directly under the city's ability to control it. So it isn't included kind of in the existing resources, if that makes sense. So there's a little bit of a summary here that kind of shows at the municipal level where we are. As a city, we've already implemented 11 of the 70 actions. There are another 12 that we have made commitments to in various ways to already advancing. And then there's another 9 that GreenLink thinks that we should move on sooner rather than later. Again, I'm not going to talk through each of these, but here are kind of what the commitments are. We can talk ad nauseum if you'd like about the things that we've already done. But these are the things we've committed to and what GreenLink is recommending in each of those areas. I'll highlight a few of them here in terms of energy efficiency policies. We have already made some substantial commitments to reduce the urban heat island effect, and I want to flag that one. A lot of our audience and probably on this call and generally are very interested in green spaces and trees. And I think it's really interesting, and GreenLink really flagged this one for us, is how important those types of investments can be from an energy efficiency standpoint. So as we work to reduce the urban heat island effect through expansion of green space or tree plantings, we've got some ability to do some pretty strong benefits from an energy efficiency standpoint. We're working on that, obviously. Mayor Jackson committed the additional $1 million for tree planting in 2020. In 2019, he made the commitment. 2020 was the first year where we had the funds available. In 2020, we were actually able to increase our annual plantings by about 300% over the previous 5-year average. And we're still continuing to make the appropriate kind of maintenance and establishment investments to make sure that as we're maintaining the existing tree stock and we're helping establish those new trees so they grow into big, full, healthy, mature trees. In terms of the GreenLink recommendations on the right side, I think we all think these all make sense. The one I would flag here that we're taking a little bit of a harder look at is the rounded up energy and water efficiency programs. We need to do a little bit more due diligence on whether that's something that we can legally do as a municipal entity. But once we kind of have a better understanding of that, we're going to start to think about what, if it's possible, what that implementation might look like. So from a clean energy and an energy storage policy standpoint, we are already looking at the city level to install some solar on some of our city facilities. We have an ordinance right now that's in front of City Council to do rooftop and ground mounted solar on up to 15 facilities. And we're working very closely with council, though it's all rooftop and ground mounted. We're working very closely with the council as well about potential expansion to include some carport installations. So taking some of our parking lots, which right now from an urban heat island standpoint are just large reflective surfaces, and maybe repurposing them into something that provides some clean energy, but also is a little bit more friendly from a heat island management standpoint. So we're working through that. That's a little bit of ways, but we're getting closer on that. That solar ordinance does include battery storage at some of our rec centers that we use as warming centers and cooling centers, so it helps support some of our broader resiliency efforts. There is a lot of really interesting recommendations here from GreenLink on the clean energy and storage policies. What I think I would flag here is just one I think we've got to figure out is LMI solar. We have one of the recommendations in the policy toolkit is to create a solar co-op. We have one in Cuyahoga County that does a lot of really good work, but we probably need to spend a little more time and energy figuring out how to get more low to moderate income participation in the solar co-op. We're working through a couple of ideas. It's a little bit early to kind of talk through those in too much detail, but we're trying to figure out a way to get some more participation and funding to support this as we move forward. And then finally, I guess I'll jump to the transportation policies. This is going to be a key component of the city's upcoming update to the citywide plan. Director Collier from City Planning and I have been talking quite a bit about this. They had already started to embed kind of mobility options and upzoning and behavioral nudging into their planning process. And we've been pretty hard at work on building out EV infrastructure. We've been working with NOACA, with the county, and a whole host of other folks to think about how to bring public side charging infrastructure to scale across the city of Cleveland. And our city focus has been on the neighborhoods to where the market may be a little bit delayed, right? So the market, as we increase EV penetration, the market is going to catch up from a charging infrastructure standpoint. We want to make sure that as we see that happening, that those investments are happening in all of our neighborhoods, including those that the market may not flag as being an early adopter area. In terms of the city fleet, we have already started to work through our transition. Hopefully you have seen one of our fantastic new EVs floating around the city. We did bring 3 in-house in 2020. I believe the plan is by the end of this year, we'll have another 10 to 15 in stock. And we're working through kind of a little bit of a fleet assessment to understand vehicle condition, replacement schedule, available capital funding to replace vehicles, what that longer term pathway to get to 100% light duty EV fleet looks like and what that timeline may be. So that's a lot. I'll stop there. I know we had a lot of good questions kind of submitted through the Eventbrite scheduler, and I've seen some things popping up in the chat. So I'll stop sharing my screen and we can jump into questions.
Yeah, so I have a decent list of questions. I want to thank those of you that submitted questions when you were registering. This definitely helps us make sure we are tailoring our presentation to things that you want to hear about, and gives us some good talking points as we're going through this. So Jason, to kick things off, we've gotten this question a lot. Why 2050? It's so far away, and climate change, and of course our contribution to it, is a big challenge now.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I think as we went through the project, we spent a lot of time thinking about. And though that bar chart that has that fuel mix on it shows that final point in time, but if you go into the report, you'll see kind of more detailed trends over time for each of those 3 pathways that we outlined there. And I think what you see is that there is a little bit of lead time before we start to see really strong effects from some of the actions that we can take. And candidly, it is largely driven by some of the restrictions that our state policy puts on us, right? So that inability to do things at larger scale and bring more utility scale renewable development, clean energy development to the table more quickly certainly has a limiting effect. I think the other thing that I would add is we could get there much more quickly if we wanted to include more renewable energy credit purchases, right? Like we could go out in the next couple months and purchase a whole bunch of renewable energy credits and say we're there. What we wanted to make sure we were doing through this planning process is investing the time and energy that that's going to allow us to get there in a way that creates more jobs, more wealth, lowers burden, and really kind of accomplishes some of our other goals in addition to our climate-related goals.
Great, thank you. A follow-up question to that I think is kind of related. Is there any information available on how that REC number would change if things change at the state level as well? I know there are a lot of moving pieces, but it seems likely some things will change at the state level over the next 30 years, or I think we at least all hope so. And if those restrictions or setbacks are eliminated, will Cleveland's plan become truly 100% renewable energy?
I think it's possible, and I think it's a little bit unknowable without knowing what the change would be, right? So you'll notice in the bar chart on the fuel mix, we didn't have a lot of other renewables, right? So we're seeing a lot of solar growth happening kind of due to market forces, and then you're seeing some pretty significant efficiency gains. I think it's about a 28% efficiency gain under that max case pathway. What you don't see in there is a tremendous amount of wind, and right, there are some very real reasons for that, setback rules, other things. So if that was the change, would that, yeah, it would absolutely either speed up the timeline, change the overall kind of mix of how we're going to get there, or reduce our longer term dependence on renewable energy credits. And I think that third outcome is the one we would all hope to see. We would hope to see all of them, but we would love to see a lower reliance on renewable energy credits by the end. It would just really depend on what the specific change would be.
Great. Next question, what types of policies, code, green building, zoning, CPP regulations, et cetera, are being developed to make local renewables easier to implement? When can we look towards energy benchmarking requirements?
So, I think this is one of the things that we looked at. So if you look at the policy toolkit, for example, there are a lot of things in there related to stretch codes and net zero energy efficiency and things that you want to attack through the building code. Because that is a very, very good tool to kind of help grow efficiency measures at the building level. As we started having those discussions with the Department of Building and Housing and Tom Vanover over there, who's the chief building officer for the city, we kind of got this kind of, and it makes sense. We don't have a lot of flexibility to go above and beyond the state code. The state building code is a requirement under Ohio Revised Code and Ohio Administrative Code. So we can incentivize, we can offer things to do it. And that's part of what the discussion, we've got to figure out what the right suite of tools looks like. But requirements and kind of stretch codes and kind of mandated things in this, it's not, it doesn't seem to be something that we have at our hands as a tool just yet. But how do we start to incentivize it? So we see a little bit of this when we look at our tax abatement policy. So our tax abatement policy has a green build element to it. So if you want that 15-year tax abatement, you've got to meet certain standards and the sort. So we're trying to figure out ways to kind of broaden that out and make that a little bit more applicable across different places. But it's really, really hard from a code mandate standpoint to make those changes right now.
Got it. All right. We've received this question a couple of times as well. What is the status of the Lake Erie Wind project? And what can residents or businesses do to support it?
So I think the status portion is the easiest part of that to answer. So we have cleared kind of that final regulatory impediment, right? So I want to say it was the end of 2020. It might have been early 2021. It's all kind of blended together through the pandemic. We did get the adverse conditions through the Ohio Power Siting Board, the poison pill about restrictions of operating hours on Linco. That was pulled out by the Ohio Power Siting Board, and the project can move forward through all of those regulatory hurdles. So now the next step is moving towards commercial operations through the power by selling the power. CPP is committed to purchasing a significant chunk of the power. The county has committed to purchasing a significant chunk of the power. We need to see if we can get more of the power subscribed to bring it into construction phase.
All right, we got this one as you were going through your presentation, so you may have to think back a little bit, but how is energy efficiency lumped into the fuel mix comparison?
Well, so I think the easiest way to think about energy efficiency and how it fits into the fuel mix comparison is, approaching it from this mindset that the cleanest kilowatt hour of energy is the kilowatt hour of energy that you don't use. So the more we can do to reduce demand, the less burden we have on the electric grid and the less challenge we have to kind of bring into have to bring in and have to find from those clean and renewable sources. So it's an absolutely critical piece. And as we went through the modeling of this, it became very apparent to us, no matter which of the pathways we looked at, whether it's the most cost effective, whether it's the maximum pathway, or whether it's one of the infinite number that we all kind of looked at playing around with the tool in between there, the biggest area that we see gains in over that business as usual pathway is almost always going to be energy efficiency. It's where we have the most ground to gain. So it's where we've got to spend a lot of our time and energy building those programs and incentives and resources out for folks. It's a critical component. Like I said, I think that max case pathway, and if I can, let me see if I can jump back over to my slides to make sure I give you the right number. Yeah, we're looking at potentially 28% of the electricity offset by energy efficiency in that maximum pathway. It's about 18% in the most cost-effective pathway. So that's a pretty significant change when you look at the total effect we can have.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to lump these two together just because they're very similar. How can CDCs get involved, and how can businesses get involved?
So CDCs, I think the first thing I would say to our friends at the CDCs, and I will say this tomorrow, I'm talking to the CDC executive directors tomorrow about this project. First and foremost, keep doing what you're doing, right? Because CDCs are already a pretty strong ally as we look to do these things. They are fantastic resources to connect people to programs and resources and first step, continue doing the work that you're doing as we begin to develop this plan more fully, right? So this is kind of the first step of this process, is this report and this toolkit. The next step comes as we look to build out new policies, new programs, and really kind of operationalize the things that we've learned through this. I would anticipate that CDCs and the business community and the nonprofit community, the educational community, we want to build a pretty robust community engagement to better understand what the needs are at the community level, what the opportunities for gain are. So CDCs in particular are fantastic resources because of the community connections that they have and the way that they have access to residents and understanding of community needs and community desires, kind of how things are kind of working and bubbling up at that level. And we need to make sure we're leveraging those connections and not just kind of saying, CDCs, here's what we're doing, but also listening and saying, CDCs, what are you hearing from residents? What are the needs we can use to help kind of meet and kind of support those things? So being a really strong facilitator and connector is a great way for CDCs to help. And that's part of what we're going to talk about tomorrow with the directors. And it's a similar thing for businesses, right? How do we support what business is trying to do? But candidly, how do we get the business community to support our broader efforts, right? It's communicating that this is a critically important thing that has value to everybody, whether you're the smallest little company of 5, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, or whether you're a big, huge, 5, 10,000 person company across the region. It's about connecting and communicating, making commitments, and then being accountable to those commitments as we move forward. And I think that's probably where we would want to have some discussions with everybody. And that's a critical portion of what we're looking at with this Clean Energy Task Force. And we kind of glossed through that. You'll see that referenced in the report. We view that as a place to collect information about what policies and programs need to be in place to support community organizations, businesses, other institutions, but also to have a very candid and honest discussion with one another about what are those commitments that we're all going to make and how are we all going to be accountable to those commitments.
All right. Did the report distinguish between what state policies impact CPP versus First Energy? And I think there's a follow-up one. How would you proceed if there were no state or regulatory filters?
Wow. So I'll take the first part of that, which is a really good question. So the CEI is obviously PUCO regulated. So state policy has a direct effect on what they do and don't do. CPP is not PUCO regulated. As a municipal utility, its regulatory agency is effectively Cleveland City Council, right? So while not directly impacted because of the competitive nature of the retail electric market in Cleveland, which is very, very unique. Like most places do not have competitive retail electric environments. The state regulatory environment tends to have a pretty strong indirect effect on what CPP can do. Now, the state, through some of the policy things, and it's one of the ones that we flagged on there, kind of the weakening of the alternative or the renewable portfolio standards, the elimination of the solar carve out, you can always, as a utility, kind of hold yourself to a higher standard than what the regulations require, but they tend to fall pretty closely in hand. We still have an alternative portfolio standard in place in the city of Cleveland. So we're still committed to reaching the 25% of our electricity from clean. CPP's 25% by 2025 goal. I think they're at 21%. The last time I think we looked at this was last year, they were at 21%. So they had met the 20% by 2020 goal. And I've had a few conversations with them over the last couple of weeks, even starting to map out what that 25%, how we're going to get to that 25% by 2025. So while not a direct effect, there's some indirect effects between the regulatory structure. The second half of that question, oh my goodness. You've stumped me. I have not thought about what I would like. I think more direct investment in utility scale renewables would expedite this process. So it would be great to see that. more funding and more support for the energy efficiency programs that kind of got phased out by some of the state policy changes would be great. Wow, I don't know that I can pick just one. I don't know who asked that, but that's a fantastic question. I will be better prepared to answer that. I'm going to have a good answer for that the next time somebody asks me.
Sorry for stumping you on that one. I just couldn't resist. It seemed like
No,
sort of sky's the limit.
That's a great question.
So we received a number of questions related to electric vehicles, EVs, and charging stations ahead of time. So can you speak to, what the city is doing to support EVs and access to EV charging infrastructure, and also how does a community demonstrate interest in EV charging stations? That's one of the questions we got in our chat.
Okay. So I think we touched a little bit on the first part of that. There's a lot of funding starting to flow towards EV infrastructure. A lot of the Volkswagen settlement dollars are being dedicated through the Ohio EPA. The first round of funding was announced a month or so ago, and we do have several locations in the city of Cleveland that are going to be supported by that. There are two in particular that the city put in that we wanted to have funded. One at the airport, and then one actually at the new rec center that's being built in Ward 1. And that kind of is following that approach that we really wanted to kind of try to get some of this charging infrastructure in places where we may not see the market get there as quickly. So we're doing that, but we're going to see more of it pop up and more of it funnel through. NOACA is really doing a pretty strong job of managing how we're starting to kind of access those funds, and is actually opening up other pots of money that's looking at publicly accessible sites for more charging infrastructure. So you're going to see us taking a look at other places, whether that's the West Side Market, whether that's other recreation centers, whether we're having discussions with the library about library access and parking garages downtown. So we're going to see more of this kind of growing through a lot of those the funds that are starting to open up and flow to this. In terms of demonstrating community support for it, this is always the tricky portion, right? I mean, do you need the infrastructure to come in order to kind of support the market purchasing of consumers, or do you get the consumers to purchase the vehicles and then the infrastructure will follow? I think it's having conversations like this and sharing interest with, feel free, our office, you've got my contact information's on there. You can reach out to Anand Natarajan, who's our energy manager, or Libby Lehman. I think they're both on here, and if they want to drop some contact information, if there's in the chat, they can do so. If there's an interest in kind of getting all of those things in, you've got to say, hey, I think it makes sense here. We'd love to hear that, because we're looking at this from a traffic modeling standpoint and kind of our own approach, but we'd love that feedback to say, hey, we think that this could work here as a community, and then let's look at community-based solutions for doing that. There are dollars available that we can access to help support that potentially. So share that information with us, because we might be able to say, hey, it's a site that's already planned for here, or it falls in this corridor model, or whatever we're doing. It may be something that we missed. And that's a great way for us to help understand where the demand is going to start to come from, and where the community would like to see some of this infrastructure.
Great, thank you. I'm going to keep it in the transportation vein before moving on to other topics. Getting RTA and the railroads to use renewable energy is important. How do we encourage this energy transition?
I know RTA is already kind of taking a look at their new models moving forward. And I think they're going to, they've already expressed kind of a commitment to some of these things. The railroads are a trickier animal, for lack of a better term. It's a bigger question. I think one ways we should think about rails, and we've seen a lot of discussion around kind of expanding rail transit for passenger rail transit in Ohio recently. And that's a good starting point, but we do need to figure out a way to better engage the rail freight companies. But that's a bit more complicated. But I think locally, from our public transit agency and our other folks who are kind of operating transportation networks here locally, The commitment appears to be there. It's just about how do we kind of create the right incentive structures to move us forward.
All right. Is there a plan to incorporate affordable solar for low-income homeowners? Also, how might we make community-supported or community-owned energy a reality?
Yeah, I think those are both critically important. So the low to moderate income solar is one that we are kind of working through right now internally. We're working with a couple of other partners about what does the funding model look like? Because I think we all agree that residential solar has a lot of benefits. Like it increases home values, it lowers energy costs, but that initial upfront CapEx can be a barrier. So we're working through a couple of ideas about how do we kind of address that capital cost standpoint to shorten the payback period. So how do we start to make the investments, whether it's cash incentives or loan? And we're not there yet in terms of what that program is going to look like, but we are really looking hard about how to kind of create something that's either a pilot that we can use to demonstrate benefit by making the investment in the solar and then bundling it with energy efficiency technology so we can really work in each home to drive the usage down, to drive the overall energy related costs as low as we possibly can to front load as much of the benefit of the investment as possible. But we honestly, candidly have some work that we need to do there. The other portion of that is community solar, and I'm glad we got this question because in the report, like I mentioned, we went through that kind of evaluation, looking at feasibility, impact, equity, and rated everything. And the ratings, you'll see them kind of all in the report. There's a big table with everything kind of listed in there. Community solar was the highest scoring policy or program in our evaluation process. So we have to kind of make some progress and movement on this. The trick with community solar here locally is we have to act as the intermediary. And we have not had a lot of success with CEI kind of advancing community solar up to this point. CPP does not have a cost recovery mechanism. They don't have a way to kind of account for the power and getting it from the solar farm to customers' homes and getting all of the accounting of that to make sure the benefits and costs all shake out to the right people and places. So the report kind of says, makes the recommendation that CPP should look at that in the next rate setting process. As they're doing their next round of rate updates, build in a mechanism to facilitate community solar. I think what we want to do is see how quickly we can front load that and how we can shorten that time frame down a little bit. We've got to have some conversations about what it looks like and how to do that. And I think everybody is open to having those conversations, but we want to kind of see if it's possible for us not to wait for that next rate setting process. Now, we may have to, as we kind of get into the details with them and kind of what they can take off and what's manageable, we may have to wait to get through there. If we could shift it a little bit kind of closer to today, that's, I think, where we want to try to end up and where we want to be. But we have to find a solution on community solar. Like I said, it was the highest scoring policy or program in the whole report.
I have a feeling this one's going to be a little bit outside of your wheelhouse, but I think it's a valuable question to bring up. Lots of new school buildings have gone up recently, and those flat roofs do not have solar panels. I know the state does not support renewables, but the panels would pay for themselves in electricity savings in 7 years or less. So why not encourage the school board to pay for those panels?
I think that's part of the broader discussion that we're going to have through that clean energy task force and some of those discussions. I think we're going to look at, does it make sense on school buildings? Does it make sense? I mean, we feel it makes sense on city facilities because we've already kind of went down that road and are looking to get those installed. Schools are great options. Other large institutional partners, a lot of folks who are doing big projects now are already including solar or renewables and storage in some capacity. There are a lot of different places we can look at. And I think every option has to be on the table and kind of providing some guidance and some support to those agencies, whether it's the school district, whether it's anybody else who's looking to do this. We want to make sure we're being as open and as engaged with them as possible, because you're right, they're potentially great resources. And in addition to the energy benefit, how do we begin to look at it from a workforce development standpoint and partner with some of these institutions and schools in particular and universities to build out the workforce components so that they can see them in kind of real-time functioning, how they work, where they live, where they exist, but then also kind of understand how they work so that as they can look at these careers in the future, they can make some inroads to obtaining some of these jobs that we're going to hopefully create through this process.
All right, we are just about at time, so I want to just be respectful of everyone's evening. We received a lot of questions in the chat that I'm sorry we were not able to get to all of them. We do copy this chat, and we will be sending out a follow-up blog that will include a copy of the presentation. I know that was one of our questions here, and we'll do our best to answer in our FAQs as many of these questions as we are able to. So with that, unless you have anything else you want to add, Jason, I'm going to close things out.
No, thanks everybody. I mean, this has been a long process for us to get to this point. We are really excited about this project, and I'm really excited to see so many people show up to listen to us kind of talk about what we've done, where we need to go, and this is the first in what I hope will be many conversations that we have with this group and everybody across the city about how to kind of get where we all know we need to be. So thanks for your attention and questions. Fantastic questions. And I'm going to go home tonight and try to think about the one thing I would do if there were no barriers. That was such a, that one caught me a little bit. That was a good question. Yep, dream big, exactly.
All right, well, thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Stay warm and dry, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going. And Brittany posted in the chat some ways to stay connected with Sustainable Cleveland, so please continue to follow us, and you'll hear about all of the other upcoming events we have over the next coming weeks and months. So have a great evening, everyone.